Hi, everyone. So Heidi Hattendorf here with Eris Global. I lead our product marketing team. I'm thrilled to be here to really kick us off today for the data benefits beyond compliance and what that means. So I'm joined here today with Kelly Nat she's the founder of K2 Consulting. She's got a deep knowledge and expertise within the regulatory field. So we're thrilled to have her here today. And also joined by Wim Siepers with Eris Global. He's the SVP for Strategy and Innovation. And he as well has deep insights into a number of different areas within life sciences and regulatory specifically. Both Wim and Kelly have been members of the EMEA SPOR task force since 2015, and they've been actively involved with this task force in helping to guide IDMP for Europe. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Wim and Kelly to really take us on this journey about some of these topics and angles related to SPOR, related to IDMP, and share their insights and thoughts with you today.
Sure. Thank you, Heidi, for the introduction. I'm very glad to be here also. I think the point essentially that we wanted to make today is essentially also, is as the title says it's beyond compliance ultimately, because of course one of the priorities that we're actually seeing, and rightly so at this time, is that companies are looking at, for instance, a standard like IDMP and also SPOR in Europe as being something that they have to do. They have to be compliant, and I'm absolutely saying you have to. And yes, but there is also the aspect of saying that there is more that you can do with this as an organization. We're seeing that a lot of the aspects are there, and this is what we wanted to highlight a little bit today here also. Kelly, I'm not sure whether you want to add something here to start us off with some examples.
Sure, yeah, thank you. And thank you, Heidi, thank you, Wim, for having me today. It's always good to talk about these topics, and as those of you who know me know, I can talk about this for days. I think when IDMP first came into our consciousness back in the mid 2010s, and we started thinking about what implementation would be and looked like, we were really thinking about it from a compliance perspective and making sure that we were going to meet the regulations. And that's certainly been an important component. But the reality is that in order to be compliant, we're going to be mastering quite a lot of data that hasn't traditionally been high quality and mastered within our organizations, that regulatory data, that registration data, and those registration details. And there are so many opportunities within the enterprise for leveraging that data within regulatory affairs, but even beyond regulatory affairs. And so I'm looking forward to being able to talk about that today.
Yeah, and to your point about this, I think the most obvious thing that people are actually seeing, because it's actually in taking it about beyond regulatory, for instance, is if I might add one example to that, is on the safety side. I think we're clearly seeing with the E2B-R3, yeah, you could actually also still say that it's within the premises of compliance, because ultimately the E2B-R3 in safety, when you report a case, you have to use the identifiers. I'm not going to go into details on those because it probably takes us too long today. But PIDs, MPIDs, you should be using those in an E2B-R3 settings. Now, a lot of people will actually say that's still compliance, but where you actually go beyond compliance and safety, and we're actually seeing that some companies are also starting to realize that, is that even within safety, using your safety system with a central product dictionary and aligned product dictionary that IDMP gives you will help also streamline some functionalities within safety. You're talking about things like automatic labeling capabilities that are used in, and I'm purely talking about from a technology perspective from our end, but automatic labeling, identifying elements around how you can improve. As I said, that's one example, but we're seeing a lot more outside of safety. Also, we've been, in the meantime, seeing some interest also from manufacturing sites, from clinical sites that actually want to see and bring that standard into their organizations also.
Yeah, I just to jump on that, Vim, I think that's so important. And one thing that is true in a lot of organizations is that the different parts of the company don't speak the same language when we talk about product family and what is a product family. And so when we start to establish dictionaries that align on that, and you've got regulatory and safety, finally truly aligning on that, and then taking that beyond into the manufacturing space, into the commercial space, and being able to all speak the same language to pull this data together in order to be able to do reporting and integrations in ways that have just not been possible before.
No, absolutely, and that common language or so, and it's very important. I mean, if you look at years ago, everybody speaks the different language. A product, you had 10 definitions of what a product ultimately was, and IDMP indeed brings those elements together and actually facilitates, as you said, integrations, communication with the different applications and the different teams also. I also just want to put one element out there, and the fact that I just want to avoid confusion in the sense that it doesn't mean that everybody has to literally adopt also what a product is, for instance. I also don't want to give the impression that suddenly everybody has to talk exactly the same language. But what I think is also important is that you can have your definition potentially fit into that standard. Yeah. So I don't want to give the impression that suddenly everybody has to accept a regulatory definition of a product or a manufacturing definition of a product. Everybody has its own level of details that they want, and everybody uses their pieces of the puzzle. Yeah. But important piece is that you have the same, all using the same puzzle from that sense. You might not use the whole thing, because if you look at IDMP, it's huge. Yeah. From a regulatory perspective, from a manufacturing perspective, you don't necessarily use all of those elements, but it's a starting point that you all use the same puzzle already, and that everybody knows which piece you're using from that particular element. Yeah. So I think that's also a fairly important aspect to take away from for today.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And when we start aligning in a way that we all understand what those things mean together at the same time, we can start to build efficiencies into some of those processes. And one of the most obvious processes is looking at the CMC variation management process, because those CMC details are so important in the SPOR PMS submissions, and are the ones that are the biggest challenge for organizations to try to figure out how they're going to manage in this new world, in this new structured data submission world. And so building those efficiencies in those processes by speaking or understanding the same language, having that same sort of translation point is a real opportunity that I hope many organizations take seriously and leverage in order to improve their own internal functions.
Yeah, and maybe one thing also that because we're focusing a lot on integrations with systems outside of out of regulatory and how regulatory, but I also want to just maybe bring up one examples where regulatory can actually benefit also, because one of the things that we're seeing, for instance, with IDMP is of course people are having a lot of documents sitting there where data has to be extracted, and NLP has been a very interesting tool that people have been using to extract that data from there. But I'd like to take it a step further also and actually see about how this data can help regulatory in, for instance, their submission process with structured content authoring, for instance, because one of the benefits also that I see is that, yeah, integrations and alignment with other departments, but within regulatory is aligning your documents with your data, I think is also a fairly important aspect. And I still remember some examples from XCVMPD where people were saying, okay, I've submitted my data, and then your third acknowledgement comes back and says, but this is not what is in your documents. So even a regulatory point of view, having that data, collecting that data will give them a lot of benefits in the short term as well as in the long term.
Yeah, Vim, that's a great point. And structured content authoring is a really interesting space. You know, I do a lot of research with Gens and Associates, and one of the things that we've looked at is structured content authoring and the interest in taking that up. And we're starting to see a building interest where in the past it was considered to be maybe an ideal, but a little bit too hard to kind of achieve. And now organizations are starting to take that seriously. Some of the vendors are starting to take that a little bit more seriously. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see how we evolve over the next few years in really being able to leverage data in a way that that we just haven't been able to before. And then we look at things like, some of the initiatives around like a Cumulus and those sorts of things that are really looking to kind of take this even to the next level. So I think we're sort of at the cusp of a really interesting time.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more on that. So I think it's exciting times, I would say, for all of us. And it seems daunting for a lot of companies to collect all of this information. But I think it's also going to be important that people look at it from a phased approach also. I mean, if you're trying to collect all that data at once, it's probably going to be too much also. And as you said at the very beginning, I think you should always keep data quality in mind also. It's yes, you want to capture as much data as you want, yeah. But you want to make sure that the data that you capture, you capture it in a high quality information. It's always better to have a little bit less to start. Of course, you have to be compliant, but it's always better to have a little bit less, but definitely your quality data. Because to your point about SCA and saying that that hasn't been looked at in the past and maybe lesser successful, it was essentially all around the quality of the data also. However, a lot of the aspects were related to that. Yeah. So your point definitely on quality is definitely also something that should be taken very seriously.
Yeah, and I think you're raising something else that's really important, which is the business process. At the end of the day, all the technology in the world can't fix poor business process, and it's business process and governance that's going to achieve that high data quality, that's going to support some of these sort of advanced capabilities that become possible with that high quality regulatory data that we're going to start having.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, now it looks, from my end at least, very, very interesting. I hope everybody else sees the same thing and the same opportunities that we are seeing from our end also. Yeah.
It is interesting. And, that's just been so great to listen to both of you and just the perspective. I think the quality of data is super important. Connected data, right? It's no longer just about volume, but what can you do with that data? And you have to have that good quality. So in business process, the people and the processes that go with it. So I'd just like to wrap up here and just say thank you again to both of you for sharing your insights and your expertise. We'll continue this series, but also wanted to thank everyone for joining. The data benefits beyond compliance. It certainly talks about how maybe these standards get us started, but there's so much more that can be done, as you heard, with organizations once you look beyond that compliance. So thank you.
Great, thank you.